Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, if you ask most Northerners who fought in the Civil War why they enlisted or received an officer's commission, you would have received different answers. To preserve the Union, to end slavery, for the bounty money, for a chance of promotion, to get out of town and do something different, to have an adventure. Any and all of those would be correct. Yet there were some officers who had quite personal reasons, private reasons, that might not have been discussed at all, certainly not in polite society. If anyone had asked John William Fenton why he joined the Army, the tall, hazel eyed 23-year-old from the Finger Lakes region of New York would probably have followed the same suit as many other folks who joined the Army, with patriotic motives, such as many of his comrades in blue. But he did have another motive, and that was to redeem his family from scandal. His early years were not ideal. His father was convicted of bank fraud after a very public trial that dragged the family name through the mud and muck of newspapers. And then the father trekked to California and died in San Francisco during the waning days of the gold rush, trying to make good things happen for himself and his family. A fragmentary paper trail suggests that young Fenton, along with his sister and a brother and his widowed mother, weathered a storm of troubles. They lived for a time in Buffalo and New York City. In fact, according to one account, Fenton seems to have run with a wild crowd. During the second spring of the Civil War, he was living in Kansas, out in the town of Shawnee. How he came to settle there is unclear. It's still a bit of an unsolved mystery. He did find work there as a banker, much as his father had been a banker. His life changed on April 9th, 1862, when he enlisted in the Army, the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. Because he was a banker and familiar with accounting and numbers, it's probably why he was assigned to be the commissary sergeant. His regiment was not sent east. They were sent west as part of a brigade headed to New Mexico territory, where they would participate in reversing Confederate gains in the region. Meanwhile, back in New York, Fenton's old pals busied themselves recruiting volunteers from military companies to become part of a new regiment that was being raised in response to Abraham Lincoln's call for volunteers to end the war. It's in the summer of 1862. Well, Fenton had a dream to join them, but he was going the wrong way. He was heading to New Mexico. His friends finally stepped in and secured him a coveted commission as an officer, and his superiors in the 2nd Kansas Cavalry relieved him of his duties so that he could leave and more or less transfer to the east. In September of 1862, Fenton left behind his sergeant's chevrons and put on the shoulder straps of a second lieutenant of that new regiment, the 132nd New York Infantry. Now, Fenton and his new regiment spent the majority of the next 3 years on outpost duty along the North Carolina seacoast, which had been secured by an amphibious expedition commanded by Brigadier General Ambrose E. Burnside. It was in early 1862. However, Confederate forces still held control of the inland region, and the 132nd New York faced hostile forces at New Bern, Bachelor's Creek, Kinston, and other crossroad villages in that coastal North Carolina area. Men fought, men died in these lesser known engagements with the same courage and dedication as the war's momentous battlefields, although in far fewer numbers on little patches of land that are largely forgotten. Fenton thrived in the army, maybe finding a home for the first time, a stable home. His fellow officers respected him as a good soldier. His superiors promoted him to captain and company command. And then came one day in 1864, a lapse in judgment cost him his commission and his connection to the military. On or about December 15th, 1864, the war was just months away from the end. He was in a New Bern restaurant kept by a free black man named Tony Fisher. Fenton, so the story goes, showed up with a prostitute in tow and a big chip on his shoulder. Fenton provoked a fight. When it was all over, Tony Fisher, the black man, the proprietor, lay brutally beaten on the floor of his own restaurant. One of the witnesses to this event happened to be the chief provost marshal, the man in charge of military police in New Bern. He moved swiftly to investigate the attack and charged Fenton on 2 counts: conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. It really wasn't an arguable case. It was open and shut. In January 1865, Fenton received an honorable dismissal from the War Department. Now, Fenton's brother officers, those ones who helped him get the commission back in 62, they came to his aid. They sent a petition to the overall commander in the region, Brigadier General Innes N. Palmer, who happened to be a fellow New Yorker, requesting that the charges against Fenton be withdrawn. Moreover, the petition said, quote, "We ask that in consideration of his past services, his general good conduct as an officer may so far mitigate your views as to induce you to accept the tender of resignation, thereby removing the offending parts, saving from disgrace his family, and punishing an officer who is much attached to the service," end quote. Well, the petition worked. Palmer stepped in. The War Department revoked the dismissal order and allowed Fenton to resign with honor. This allowed him to leave the army with his reputation intact and to avoid further disgrace on the family. Fenton was more or less finished in the East. He headed back out west to seek his fortune. Oddly enough, much like his father did back in 1849 during the gold rush. In fact, he followed the same path blazed by his father. He joined a couple of old army buddies and signed on to an expedition not to California, but to Montana Territory. The group gathered in Minnesota and prepared to leave by wagon train from St. Cloud on August 1st, 1865. Their departure, however, was delayed by negotiations between the government and Native Americans. To kill time, Fenton and another party member, according to one account, went on a frolic into the wilds of Minnesota on horseback. They brought along a Newfoundland dog named Monty, belonged to Fenton's companion. At some point during the trip, miles away from civilization somewhere in the outback of Minnesota, a blizzard caught the small group off guard. The horses were lost during what turned out to be a 3-day storm. According to one account, quote, "Not a living thing seemed to occupy the desolate waste of ice and snow," end quote. The account continued. The intense cold had frozen the feet of Captain Fenton, and death stared both men and the dog in the face. Fenton suggested to his friend that they attach a note that explained the dire situation to Monty's neck and send the Newfoundland to fetch help. They did it. Minutes after Monty left, they heard the sharp crack of a rifle, and both men, cold, freezing, were shocked and startled. They feared the worst for Monty. Fenton's companion went to investigate, took a rifle with him. He discovered an armed Native American in the distance and shot and killed the man. Then he discovered that the Indian had shot a fox, not Monty. The companion, Fenton's companion, buried the dead Native American man in the snow and brought the fox back to Fenton for food. Meanwhile, Monty continued. He crossed paths with a cavalry patrol of U.S. troopers. The troopers mistook Monty for a wolf and shot him. Upon discovering the error, they found the note and rescued Fenton and his friend. Fenton was in bad shape, frostbitten in both feet. He suffered the amputation of his left foot up to the instep and all the toes on his right foot. Fenton, now disabled, managed to make his way back east. That was in 1866. And he settled in Washington, D.C. There he worked several jobs, including as a clerk in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, ironically. He also married Jane Hyatt, who was also in Washington, and together they had a son named Arthur. After Jane died in 1885, he remarried a German-born woman named Elsie Steffens. She worked in the Treasury Department and was 20 years his junior. She bore him another son, John Jr., in 1888. Shortly before the youngest son and his namesake's third birthday in 1891, Fenton died of pneumonia. He was only 53. Today, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery, you'll find Fenton's simple white grave in the green grass of the cemetery. So thanks for listening to the story of John William Fenton, the 2nd Kansas Cavalry, the 132nd New York Infantry, his trials and tribulations, and how a moment, a lapse in judgment, cost him everything. Thanks for listening. See you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.